Hello, I'm John Foster, and I'm a medical doctor who does Social Security disability exams. And today I'm going to be presenting the first in a two-part series of physical signs for differentiating physical from functional illness. As usual, everything I say represents my own opinions based on my own experience and learning, and not those of the Social Security Administration or any other medical body. I'll be presenting some established signs, some somewhat archaic signs, and some new signs that I believe I've identified. As I've mentioned in a previous video, I don't like to make the diagnosis of functional illness based on one symptom or sign alone. I prefer to have at least three, and the more the better. I'm always leery of making the diagnosis of functional illness and missing the fact that the patient does have a physical illness. The only circumstance in which I'll make a diagnosis of functional illness based on one sign is when I've clearly seen the patient do something, perhaps when they didn't know they were being observed, and then they claim to be completely unable to do it during the physical exam. That's rare in my experience. I'm sure you've seen videos of, for example, people who complain of being completely disabled due to low back pain, and then are videoed bowling or water skiing or some such activity. Those people are clearly malingering. So on to the signs I find useful. The first two signs are related to the eyes, and the first is eyelid batting while the eyes are being examined. The patient makes frequent, excessive blinking movement, sometimes grimacing as though looking were painful. Now we all know there certainly are conditions where frequent blinking is unavoidable and common, such as a corneal foreign body. But what I'm looking for here is a patient who during the history blinked normally and infrequently, and only when I direct my attention to their eyes does the batting of the eyelids commence, and then it ends when I'm examining other parts of their body. The second eye sign is pain with extraocular movements. I check extraocular movements in every patient regardless of complaint. Again, there are some rare conditions where extraocular movements can be painful. For example, I've had ethmoid sinusitis in my left ethmoid sinus, and when I moved my eyes to the right, it caused sinus pain because I was bending the lamina papyracea. As with eyelid batting, if this sign is only present when directing your and the patient's attention to their eyes and is not present during the history or the rest of the exam, it's a good indication of functional illness. The third sign is an old sign which appears to have fallen out of favor, although it can still be found reference to in the PubMed, and it's called La Maladie de Petit Papier, which is French for the illness of the little piece of paper. This is the patient who comes in with an extensive list of complaints written out in notes, which they proceed to read off to the physician. I find this suggestive but not diagnostic of functional illness because I've had several patients with trouble with memory or with very long, complicated histories who brought in notes that I thought they really needed to help them provide a complete history. So I would consider this a yellow caution flag, but not a red flag. Spinal problems such as neck and low back pain are perhaps the most common complaints in patients presenting for Social Security disability exams. and I have several findings that I've found tend to indicate functional illness. The first is overreaction to light palpation of the spine. As everyone knows, the spinal structures responsible for spinal pain, the discs, ligaments, nerves, and bones, are deep. They are not affected by lightly brushing the fingers over the skin of the spine. They are affected by deep palpation or percussion, thumping of the fist over the spine. When a patient reacts as though light palpation of the skin over the spine is agonizing, I feel that's a strong indicator of functional illness. We can expect patients with low back problems to have a restricted range of motion of the lumbar spine, and here are two useful ways to differentiate physical from functional impairment of movement. I like to ask patients with low back pain to remove their shoes. That requires considerable lumbar flexion. In most cases of low back pain, that will be painful or difficult for the patient. I've had patients who were unable to remove their shoes and needed me to assist them, or told me that they wore slip-on sandals because they couldn't bend over to tie their shoes anymore. And that's certainly an indication of serious physical back pain. On the other hand, a patient who easily flexes their lumbar spine almost 90 degrees to untie their shoes is less suggestive of a physical problem. The next low back sign I like to check for is difficulty with lying down on the exam table and rising from a supine position. In both of those circumstances, the patient is essentially doing an old-fashioned straight leg sit-up. And old-fashioned straight leg sit-ups have been pretty much banished from modern exercise routines because they place extreme stress on the low back, enormous pressure on the lumbar discs. When a patient has serious physical low back pain, I expect them to have at least some difficulty lying down on the exam table from a sitting position. Getting back up from a supine position, in my experience, is even more difficult for patients with physical low back pain. What they will learn to do is to first roll on their side and then sit up. This puts far less pressure on the lumbar discs. When a patient complaining of severe low back pain is lying supine on the table and I ask them to stand up, and they immediately sit up straight with no difficulty whatsoever, I consider that a red flag for functional low back pain. The last two signs are new signs that I've named. They have not been verified, but I have found a 100% correlation between positivity in these signs and functional illness. They may work for you or they may not. I make no guarantees. The first I call the do it again sign. I check sensation in the arms and legs of every patient. Some patients definitely have sensory deficits. What I'm talking about here is a patient who I test their sensation and they look at me puzzled and then say, do it again. In my experience, 100% of these folks have functional sensory loss. Here's what I believe is going on. It's quite easy to differentiate normal from abnormal sensation. At various times, I've had mild bilateral carpal tunnel syndrome, and a left peroneal nerve sensory palsy. In each case, it was obvious which parts of my body had normal sensation and which parts had loss of sensation and an unusual tingling feeling when touched. So once again, the do it again sign is a patient in whom, after you've initially tested their sensation, they ask you to do it again because they're unsure if their sensation is normal or not. The final sign I call the sarcastic laugh sign, and again I found this pathognomonic of functional illness, and I believe I have a psychological basis for it. The sign is, at the end of every exam, I have the patient perform what I call agility tests as long as they're able to stand and walk. These include walking on their tiptoes, walking on their heels, walking heel to toe like a sobriety test, and squatting as low as possible and then rising. The sarcastic laugh sign includes, after I've asked a patient to do something like walking on their tiptoes, looking at me in askance, giving a sarcastic laugh, and making some remark that indicates I'm an idiot, such as, yeah, as if that's going to happen. In every single case, when I've encouraged the patients to make an attempt, they've been able to do whatever I asked, although sometimes with a bit of difficulty. Here's what I believe is going on psychologically. It's awful to be disabled. In fact, I find that 100% of the truly disabled patients that I see agree with my statement, disability really sucks. Disabled patients would give anything to regain normal health. And they tend to use denial and have a tendency towards depression. Because disability is so awful, they try to minimize it, which is a form of denial. And when I ask them to do something like walking on their toes, even if they know it will be difficult, they really, really want to be able to do it, and so they make an attempt. In fact, so eager are seriously disabled patients to complete these agility tests that sometimes I have to stop them because they're at risk of falling or because it's obviously painful for them. On the other hand, patients with functional illness do not want to seem well. They want to seem as ill as possible. And thus, when I ask them to do something like walking on their toes, that's the last thing they want to demonstrate that they're capable of. They also may be angry with me for even suggesting that they might be able to do something difficult, because that indicates I may not feel they're as disabled as they claim to be. Well, I hope this has been helpful. My next video will be on more physical signs useful for differentiating physical from functional disease. And as ever, if it happens, it's possible.